Today at the National Press Club, television producer and performer Andrew Denton. Mr. Denton's won multiple awards for his work in television. Today he's speaking about euthanasia and the need for a law for assisted dying. Here's Andrew Denton with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and today's Westpac Luncheon Address. I'm Mark Kenny, Chief Political Correspondent with Fairfax Media. Our guest today is well known to us all. I first met Andrew Denton a decade ago on a cold winter night here in Canberra. Earlier that day, I'd been rushing across one of Parliament House's many courtyards and I'd slipped on the wet granite surround of a water feature and landed right in the water feature, in my suit. And all of this happened in front of Prime Minister John Howard. Andrew was in the capital that night for a literary event with Virginia Hausiger, my wife, with whom he shared a publisher. And on that night, he gave me some very consoling and prescient advice. He said, "You feel very embarrassed now. You probably want the earth to swallow you up. But in a few months from now, you'll be raising this story yourself. You'll be telling this story at dinner parties. Because let's face it, it's hilarious." And so here I am today giving proof to that, telling you the story on national television. It was merely a glimpse, really, of Andrew's keen observation of the human condition, his humour, his understanding and observation of life, and as we'll hear today, his thoughts about the last stage of life, the path to death. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome to the lectern broadcaster, comic, author, TV producer, Andrew Denton.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you all for coming. It's great to be here on a day where only the Olympics and the census are distracting attention. I've come here today to try and light a fire, and let me strike the first spark by telling you the story of 90-year-old South Australian Eileen Dorr. As she was dying of cancer last year, Eileen kept a diary. Despite her clearly stated wish to die, she was forced to endure 17 painful weeks until the disease finally took her. Hoping to hasten nature's course, she began to starve herself to death. In her diary she wrote, "My country's laws decree death by 1,000 cuts for me." If you've ever died for a week, you know how unpleasant that is. Imagine a month of it, or more, weaker and weaker, with all the unpleasantness of starvation, plus the symptoms of her cancer, weaker still, and still not dead. How can our laws allow such a thing? Not just allow, but insist on it. And why, despite polls which consistently show Australians overwhelmingly support a law that would have helped Eileen to die humanely, has no Australian Parliament responded to the public will? I'm going to come back to that, but first, a quick rundown of how I get to be standing in front of you. The 2 times failed Gold Logie nominee, now deeply engaged in what is literally a life and death issue. Watching my father Kit die remains the most profoundly shocking experience of my life. He was 67, and although clearly dying of heart failure and obviously in great pain, Dad was assisted to die in the only way that Australia's laws then and now would allow. He was given ever-increasing doses of sedatives to settle the pain. When your heart fails, fluid backs up in your lungs and you spend all day, every day, fighting for breath. It's like waterboarding, trying to suck air through a damp mask, drowning and being revived again. Of course, morphine couldn't relieve his distress, not his and not ours. He never got a high enough dose to actually kill him. The images of those final days will never be erased. That was 19 years ago. In the years since, whenever I've talked about it, I've been struck by how many respond with similar stories about people they love dying slowly, in pain, and sometimes terror, while being denied proper medical help. So 18 months ago, I set out to discover why good people are being forced to die bad deaths. I travelled to places where laws to assist dying have been operating successfully for many years, to Belgium, the Netherlands and Oregon. I discovered that contrary to what I'd heard in Australia, it is possible to construct laws with strong safeguards and protections. I discovered that after up to 20 years living with these laws, they have strong and widespread public support, that the fears have not been realised, there is no slippery slope. I discovered families profoundly grateful that thanks to these laws, people they love that have been offered a choice and the reassurance of control over what would otherwise have been cruel, lingering deaths. Perhaps most significantly of all, I discovered a golden rule that applies the world over, and that is that most people do not want to die. They will do just about anything to stay alive, to be with family, to celebrate a grandchild's birthday, to wake up and marvel at the beauty of a sunrise. Take Oregon, where the number of people legally helped to end their life is less than 1% of all deaths annually. By law, they must be dying of a terminal illness to be prescribed life-ending medicine. Yet nearly 40% of them choose, in the end, not to take it. People only give up because the suffering or the daily loss of dignity they experience means that for them there is indeed something worse than death. I documented this journey in a podcast series called Better Off Dead, 17 episodes in all, culminating in a call from Bob Hawke to introduce an assisted dying law in Australia. It's still available freely online, but what's changed since I launched the series earlier this year is that both Canada and California have enacted their own voluntary assisted dying laws, meaning there are now over 100 million people in the world who have full choice about what happens to them at the end of life. None of them Australians. It's not that we lack the desire. Polls show support for voluntary euthanasia in this country consistently runs at over 70%. It's not that we lack the wit. I mean, we've done it before. It was Australia which enacted the world's first assisted dying laws. Many of you will remember the Northern Territory 20 years ago, and the first man to use it was a 66-year-old Darwin carpenter called Bob Dent, dying from prostate cancer. Both his testicles had been removed. He'd lost 25 kilos, wore a catheter and a leg bag, and as he said himself, couldn't get a hug in case his ribs cracked. Under that law, Bob and 3 others got the release they so desperately wanted. But in less than a year, the Howard government overturned not the law itself, but the law which permitted territories to make such laws, just to make sure. One of the most effective political campaigns in recent history is how Fairfax's Michael Gordon described it at the time. It's also the story of a network. All the principles are Catholics, its influential connections, its single-mindedness, and the tactics it employed. A network which kept its profile so low as to be almost subterranean. This, Gordon wrote, was an integral component of the strategy. We'll come back to those subterranean forces. As I've discovered, they're still with us, working against the clear popular will for assisted dying laws, using the old crude but sadly effective weapons of denial and deception. But first, let's look at the consequences of their work. Let's face the truth about what's actually happening across our country in the absence of such laws. The damage done, as we've titled this book, describes the landscape with shocking clarity. The daughter whose dying mother beseeches her to end the pain, who actually picks up the pillow and hovers above that loved face, but reels away, unable to go through with it. We can name that daughter. She was TV personality Tracy Spicer. The grandfather, so racked by late-stage cancer, he writes a farewell message on his to-do today pad before hanging himself on the clothesline behind his house. His name was Ken. Here's a copy of the note. The son who found his body has Down syndrome. A woman dying of motor neurone disease, desperate for release, but too ill to fly to a jurisdiction with kinder laws. It's so much worse than I imagined, she scrawls on a blackboard and asks her friend Elizabeth to make sure these words are seen, her own contribution to law reform. Just 3 of the 72 testimonies in this book, written by the dying and their loved ones, detailing trauma and suffering on a staggering scale. These testimonies come from people aged 14 to 100 and from all walks of life. They represent almost every Australian state and territory. They are blue-collar, white-collar, devoutly religious, avowedly not. The diseases they faced are mostly cancer, but also multiple sclerosis, motor neurone disease, and other medical horrors. What brings them together is the cruel way they all suffered, or suffer still, with descriptions such as akin to torture and like a horror movie. What strikes the reader are the repeated expressions from those left behind of shock, anger, and helplessness, sometimes reaching back decades. Perhaps bravest of all are the testimonies from doctors and nurses, some of whom openly admit to committing the crime of assisting a patient to die. The trauma many of them have had to deal with in the face of their patient's suffering is palpable. The guilt others still feel because the law forbade them from helping, just as keen. Had the abuses, cruelty and harm inflicted by our laws, and so vividly captured in this book, happened within one institution, our politicians would surely have acted on them long ago. But because they've happened in many places, palliative care wards, nursing homes, general hospitals, people's houses, and because each has been a private tragedy, they have been invisible, ignorable, deniable. What is undeniable is that desperate people take desperate measures. And here we turn away from anecdote and private pain to the formal findings of the cross-party Victorian Parliamentary Inquiry into End-of-Life Choices, the most extensive inquiry of its kind ever held in Australia, which reported in June this year, and which mirrored the anguished testimonies listed in this book. It found repeated examples for those with a serious and incurable condition of inadequate pain relief and of deep suffering beyond even the reach of palliative care. It found doctors breaking the law and relatives being put on trial to relieve the torment of their patients and loved ones. Most shocking was the testimony of Victorian coroner John Olley, who detailed the horrific ways in which desperately ill Victorians were and are taking their own lives to end their suffering. His evidence rocked the committee and was so distressing the coroner had to collect himself 3 times while speaking, including the case of a 90-year-old man with cancer who killed himself by repeatedly firing a nail gun into his head and chest. Coroner Olley went out of his way to stress that these were people without a history of mental illness, from loving families faced with the slow, irreversible decline of chronic disease. He said his office saw no way of preventing these deaths, quoting directly, "To my knowledge, the people we're talking about have made an absolute clear decision. The only assistance that could be offered is to meet their wishes, not to prolong their life." He estimated the number of elderly Victorians dying this way, by suicide, to escape the ravages of disease, at 1 a week. Faced with such evidence, the committee found that maintaining the status quo was unacceptable, and this was a clear case for law reform. Its recommendation, by a majority of 6-2, was that voluntary assisted dying with strong safeguards be introduced as another option at the end of life. How, you might ask, can all this evidence, all these experiences, all this torment not lead to a change of law in this country? How can we turn our backs on what we know is happening, this terrible and widespread suffering? Well, let's see how it happened last time. The story of how the Northern Territory law came to be repealed by Parliament bears repeating, because the forces that stopped it then are still in play. The joint operation was led on the Liberal side by a young Kevin Andrews, a leading member of the Conservative Lions Forum, dubbed by some the God Squad, who worked in tandem with rising Labor star Tony Burke. Only 25, and not even in the federal parliament, Tony was an ambitious young foot soldier with the Shop, Distributive and Allied Employees Union. They were supported by a group of Conservative politicians from both parties. Their campaign was also given significant extra parliamentary support from 2 wealthy and well-connected Catholic businessmen. Looking back now, 2 things are striking. First is that on the questions that are most fundamental to how we live, love and die, religious belief trumps everything. This is the theocracy hidden inside our democracy. Second is that what Kevin Andrews and Tony Burke engineered was an outright denial of the will of the people of the Northern Territory as expressed through their elected representatives. It's an issue where denialism is still rampant today. Denial of the public will, denial of the evidence. I learned firsthand how this works when I attended an international conference hosted by the Hope Anti-Euthanasia organisation in Adelaide last year. Convened by a one-time senior officer of the Catholic Archdiocese of Adelaide, the conference heard a lot about how to influence politicians. This was how former New Hampshire legislator Nancy Elliott spelt out the tactics that had worked for her in the States. When you have lots of arguments, she said, if one argument gets blown out of the water, you still have more, and each argument will reach somebody else. For instance, one way to oppose assisted dying is to suggest it is a threat to people with a disability. I'll explain why this is untrue later, but as Nancy enthused, right now, the disability argument is really kicking it. It's very powerful. Will it always be powerful? We don't know. 2, 3, 4 years from now, that may have holes kicked in it just for different reasons, so we have to be flexible. Citing elder abuse and suicide contagion as other good arguments, she went on to say, "You only have to convince legislators that they don't want this bill. You don't have to win their hearts and minds. All you have to do is get them to say, 'Not this bill,' and then you've got your win." I call these tactics FUD, fear, uncertainty, doubt. So one seed of FUD and you can reap a harvest of political inaction. Just scare the hell out of people without ever engaging with the evidence accumulated now over 20 years in countries with assisted dying laws. And here it is. 1. The vast majority of people who access these laws overseas are dying of cancer and are in the last weeks or even days of their lives. 2. The groups most in need of protection from abuse under these laws, the elderly and the disabled, have faced no increased risk under them. 3. These laws have not adversely affected the relationship between patients and doctors, but in fact its opposite. And 4. That there is a powerful palliative effect in simply giving people the means of ending the horror, some sense of control, even if they choose not to take it. This evidence is overwhelmingly accepted by the people, medical professions, media, courts and parliaments in the places where these laws exist. If you aren't even going to proceed on the basis of evidence, what are you doing? You're engaging in a deliberate strategy of denialism and the propagation of myths. Myths that have been planted in the minds of many as the truth because, at face value, they sound plausible. I went to test them. Myth 1, the slippery slope. The idea being that once you write a law to assist people to die, there is no way of controlling it. Let me take that face on. It's such a potent and alarming proposition, I searched assiduously for credible evidence of it in countries with assisted dying laws and found none. Nor did the Victorian Committee, which travelled overseas to the same countries to speak with doctors, medical and legal experts, palliative care specialists, disability rights groups and opponents of these laws to see how they were working. Instead, they found rigorous safeguards, monitoring procedures and high levels of compliance sitting within robust regulatory frameworks focused on transparency, patient-centred care and choice. Instances of assisted dying are rare, they reported, and assistance in dying is, in the vast majority of cases, provided to people in what would otherwise be the final weeks of their lives. They concluded, "We found no evidence of institutional corrosion or the often cited slippery slope." Neither did the Quebec Select Committee before them, which spent 2 years on its own investigation, also travelling overseas, before recommending for a law on assisted dying. It reached the same conclusion as Victoria: no slippery slope and tiny numbers of people using the law. The numbers? In the Netherlands, according to official data accepted by their parliament, those assisted to die comprises less than 4% of all deaths each year. In Belgium, it's 2%, and in Oregon, remember, less than half of 1%. In all three places, after decades of operation, public support for these laws is in excess of 80%, opposition less than 10%. All those numbers have been stable for many years. So let's say it clear and move on, no slippery slope. Myth 2, no law can be written to safeguard the vulnerable. The most frequent dog whistle used by opponents of assisted dying. The insinuation that the most vulnerable in our society, the elderly and the disabled, will be coerced to die under these laws because they've become a burden. As Archbishop Anthony Fisher so cleverly put it at a debate last year, putting Granny out of her misery so easily becomes putting Granny out of ours. As with the slippery slope, there is no credible evidence from overseas to support this. Rather, there's a mountain of widely accepted, publicly available, peer-reviewed evidence to disprove it. Representatives of peak elderly and disability groups who I spoke with in Belgium, the Netherlands and Oregon reported no abuse or threat of abuse to their members in all the years these laws have operated. Australian palliative care physician Dr. Linda Sheehan used her 2012 Churchill Fellowship to explore how these laws work overseas. Not an advocate for assisted dying, but an advocate for an informed debate about it, Dr. Sheehan concluded, "The slippery slope in terms of risk to vulnerable groups has not been demonstrated by the data. Why? Because once you understand how these laws work, you understand how they protect the vulnerable. More on that later. Myth 3. If things get bad, doctors will help you anyway. They might, and as the Victorian Committee found, some Australian doctors do. I suspect many of us in this room know such cases. All these doctors are liable to prosecution, and some, for ethical or legal reasons, refuse to take the risk, as is their right. And if they do help, it must be done covertly, which results in a terrible irony, the very situation anti-euthanasia campaigners seek to avoid. People dispatched in secret, for who knows what motive. No supervision, no record, no regulation. That is the current status quo. Patients have no right to insist on relief from their suffering. Doctors have every right to refuse. It's not only dangerous and murky, but also deeply unfair. Because while a person in bed 2A may get that extra morphine, the person in bed 2B may not. And what if that person in bed 2B is you? Why should any of us be put at this risk? No one is protected, not the doctor and not the patient. That's why we need laws and open, transparent decisions. Myth 4. Powerful drugs and palliative care can eliminate pain and distress at the end of life. Australia has one of the best palliative care systems in the world. We should be proud of it. Any serious proponent of assisted dying supports their work and agrees they should be better resourced. But all the resources in the world won't address everybody's suffering, and Palliative Care Australia knows it. In their own words, they cannot relieve all pain and suffering, even with optimal care. Their statistics, collected every year from 106 palliative care units around Australia, prove it. The Victorian inquiry found the same. This is not to criticise their work. The numbers of people truly beyond their help are small. By their own estimates, about 4% of their patients. But they exist, and their suffering, as recorded in this book, is savage. This is the reality of modern medicine. Yes, it can keep us alive longer, but it can't always treat what comes with that. It is also a statistical fact that those who might seek assisted dying aren't all in hospital. Some are struggling to cope in nursing institutions and old age facilities, others at home. In his evidence to the Victorian inquiry, Coroner Ollie stated clearly that many of those whose suicides he recorded were people unlikely to qualify for palliative care. And of course, there are others suffering with long-term incurable illnesses such as advanced multiple sclerosis and motor neurone disease, whom no amount of palliative care will adequately help. As to the argument made by some doctors that powerful drugs at the end of life can treat all pain, it's a medical sleight of hand. True in most cases, but not in all. Here is Professor Richard Chai, Head of Palliative Care at St Vincent's Sacred Heart, Sydney. I'm not going to say I'm going to control everybody's physical pain, because there will always be some patients who will have pain that is not controlled. But I also make sure that I tell patients, I'm going to help you live with that pain. But pain is only part of the story, because the relevant word here is not pain, but suffering. I don't want to force you to sit through a litany of symptoms that can create suffering, but they include panic brought on by suffocation, delirium, nausea, and mental anguish. Sometimes these overlap. Often they are compounded by multiple side effects from multiple drugs. The option most usually taken when they can no longer be controlled is palliative sedation, being put into a coma. For many patients and their families, this is perfectly acceptable. But not every patient wants to die in a coma while their family watches on. And it neatly sidesteps the reality that this option is a response to suffering that has already happened. Suffering that may have lasted days, weeks, or for an unlucky few, months. And if this was your mother, your sister, your father, would that be enough? Would you want them to be helped to live with that suffering? Or should they be offered the choice to escape it? What would you want for yourself? Everyone I spoke to in palliative care, whether they believed in a law or not, acknowledged the existence of bad deaths, patients who they wish they could have done more for. And in these hardest cases, no one is spared. As one palliative care physician told me, the dying are the witnesses to their family's pain, just as the family are witnesses to theirs. The leadership of Palliative Care Australia opposes a law for assisted dying. This opposition is more than purely medical. Almost 60% of Australia's palliative care services are provided by the Catholic Church. Their core ethos is to neither prolong nor hasten death. Yet the conversation within palliative care is slowly changing, partly due to the research of Dr. Sheehan. Her study of practices overseas shows that in places where these laws exist, palliative care services have actually strengthened. It also highlighted the words of the father of Australian palliative care, Professor Ian Maddox, who said, "Rather than fighting a rearguard action, I suggest the proponents of palliative care join forces with the advocates of assisted dying and with mutual respect and dialogue ensure that laws are framed with a care and precision that allows no abuse and promotes best outcomes." He's right. The aims of palliative care, to alleviate suffering and make possible a good death for the dying and their families, are also the aims of those who seek a more compassionate law. It is important in the writing of that law that palliative care be brought to the table. And then there's the disability communities with their own unique concerns and divided opinions. Some strongly oppose assisted dying. This comes from their lived experience of being viewed as having lives of less value. I have no doubt this experience is genuine. Others are strongly in support. They want the same choices available to them as for anyone else. Both rightly demand to have adequate safeguards in place so that a person is never pressured into ending their life. They too must be heard when writing a law. So what might a law look like? Based on those that have been successfully written overseas, it would have 3 bedrock principles. 1, to access it, you must be a mentally competent adult. This excludes children or those with dementia or Alzheimer's disease. 2, your request must be voluntary. 3, you must suffer from a physical illness. This excludes purely psychiatric suffering. At a minimum, you should be diagnosed with a terminal illness. This is defined in Oregon as an incurable and irreversible disease which will, within reasonable medical judgment, produce death within 6 months. Though some, like myself, would argue against a time limit because some conditions have a longer prognosis but are nonetheless intolerable. For example, there is a strong case for a law that will also help those suffering from chronic degenerative illnesses such as motor neuron disease and multiple sclerosis. The suffering, which can last months or years in these conditions, may in some ways be greater than that of an illness such as cancer. Almost half of the cases listed by Coroner Ollie fall within this definition. Before excluding them, we have to ask ourselves, is that fair? And if not, I would argue that the criteria for acceptance be an irreversible and incurable physical condition which is unbearable to the sufferer, a broader law closer to those in Europe and Canada. The gates someone has to go through to qualify are the same in either case, and they are many. The first gate is you and your natural aversion to being dead. Only you can ask for assistance, and only if you're of sound mind. The second is to convince 2 doctors, independent of each other, at least one of whom practices in your disease, that your symptoms are either terminal or irreversible, incurable and unbearable. As in the Netherlands, the first consultation should be without the family, so the doctor, usually your GP, can determine if this is indeed your considered wish. The third gate is that a request for assistance to die must be put once in writing, independently witnessed, and twice orally. The fourth, both doctors have to explore all treatment options with you, including palliative care. The fifth gate is that should either doctor consider that any psychological disorder is impairing your judgment, they'll refer you to a psychiatrist, as happens in Canada, California, Oregon, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Once your primary doctor is satisfied that you have met all the criteria, she will then write you a prescription for life-ending medicine, which you can drink. Having received it, you have to complete a form attesting that this is your decision and that you fully understand its consequences, this to be included in your medical record. All of which leads to the final gate. Again, you. Only you can decide to drink the medicine. As Oregon shows, many choose not to. You can rescind your request for it at any time. If your disease means that you can no longer swallow, a doctor may legally inject you. Your written requests and medical record, both doctors' notes, and if required, the psychiatrist's, all go to the coroner's office and also a committee of review. In the Netherlands, this consists of a doctor, lawyer, and ethicist. Both bodies have the power to call in doctors for questioning and to refer their conduct to police for prosecution. That is what a law for assisted dying would look like, not a licence to bump off granny. A carefully written law you can access only if you have an extreme medical condition from which you are dying and which protects doctors from prosecution should they follow strict criteria. I want to emphasise that what I'm proposing is a law to make legal a practice that's already happening in Australia, but happening, as the Victorian inquiry found, without regulation, without support, without transparency or accountability, and from the evidence received, sometimes without consent. In Australia right now, if you're dying and wish to end your suffering, by law you're allowed to commit suicide with all the trauma and darkness that entails. Also by law, you can opt for a slow exit, refusing treatment, including food and water, even if it's life-sustaining. This can take days, even weeks, and was described to me by a senior palliative physician as psychologically painful, both for the person going through it and their loved ones watching on. How extraordinary is this, to live in a society where it is legally and ethically acceptable for a dying patient to endure a slow, tortuous death by dehydration and starvation, or to end their life violently and alone. Yet it is legally and ethically unacceptable for that same dying patient to choose a quick and painless end to their suffering. Yet this is the position that the Church and the AMA continue to lobby for. Not their constituencies, surveys suggest. Only 29% of Australian doctors are actually members of the AMA. A majority of Catholics polled support assisted dying laws. But the well-connected hierarchies are not for turning. And those most affected by the power of these vested interests, the elderly, the sick, the grief-stricken, the traumatised, are often those least capable of pushing back. It's an unfair fight. So I've formed an organisation to fight for them. It's called Go Gentle Australia. Our aim is to create awareness of the suffering that is happening in our community and to galvanise that 70% or more of public support so that politicians can no longer ignore it. We're being supported in this by people representing many groups: doctors, nurses, palliative care, cancer support, the disability community, Dying with Dignity organisations, the elderly, the legal fraternity, and politicians from all parties. We don't argue for a right to die. Death is not a right, death is a fact at the end of life. We do argue for the right to have a choice about what happens to us at the end of our lives, not to be coerced when we are at our most vulnerable into a cruel and avoidable suffering. Our first priority is to get a law properly debated on the evidence within every state parliament. Our second is to get a sensible and compassionate law passed to stop this damage. We've received financial backing from a number of organisations and some of Australia's most respected businessmen. We'll be saying more about them in due course, but I'd like to mention one, Peter Joseph, chairman of the Black Dog Institute and former chair at St Vincent's Hospital, Sydney, who's here as our guest, and has offered this statement. It's simple. A good life includes a good death. Just as we should live free from needless suffering, so we should die. In my opinion, the suicide rate in this country would drop significantly if assisted dying was seen as part of assisted living. We are also working closely with a key medical group that officially supports an assisted dying law. Significantly, the one that sees the suffering of patients daily and up close, Australia's Nurses Union, the ANMF. But we're under no illusions about the behind-the-scenes power and deep pockets of those who oppose reform. This book, The Damage Done, is the first part of our campaign. We've also created a full-page ad. We're not allowed to show it here, and we can't afford to run it, but if someone would like to run it for us, we'd be very grateful. The Damage Done is not intended as a critique of Australia's palliative care services or the dedicated doctors and nurses who give their best. Rather, it reveals what happens despite their efforts. It is intended, however, as a rebuke to those politicians who have been derelict in their duty these past 2 decades, when 28 attempts have been made in different state parliaments to pass an assisted dying law. Not one has got to a stage where even the detail of such a law could be debated. By failing to properly examine the claim that no safeguard can be devised to protect the vulnerable, our politicians have failed instead to protect the people they represent. After all, who could be more vulnerable or in need of protection than the dying and their families? There is every reason to believe the damage and despair found unacceptable by the Victorian inquiry exists across Australia and will likely increase as our population ages. That harm and the testimonies collected in this book ask hard questions of us. Simply opposing laws on moral or ethical grounds is not an answer to these questions. Denial and manipulation of evidence is not an answer. This is a serious public health issue. That elderly Australians are killing themselves violently at the rate of more than one a week because there is no way they can be legally helped to escape the ravages of disease is a national tragedy. And for all those who do end their lives this way, how many others lie in nursing homes and hospitals wishing they could be helped humanely to do the same? How many patients are dying without enough pain relief because doctors are terrified to give them more? How many doctors, confronted by the suffering of their patients, are being forced to break the law knowing that they have no protection? And how many Australians are suffering years of chronic, unrelenting pain while their families are scarred with trauma and guilt because they can do nothing to help the ones they love when they most desperately need it? In the words of Coroner Ollie, there is a cry for help. It may be muted, it may be veiled, but it is there nonetheless. And they all know it, including doctors. They know that this person is screaming for help, but no one is going to answer the call, not in this society. I believe that no compassionate society would knowingly support this level of suffering. We are a compassionate society, but we have not been aware of the scale of the damage. That's why I've come to light a fire for all the people in this book, and also for those whose stories we do not yet know. I invite them to come forward and make this fire bigger. I invite those doctors and nurses who've seen this suffering and know it to be wrong to add to this fire and light it in their hospitals and their communities. I invite all state coroners to build it higher by joining Coroner Ollie in casting light on how our elderly are dying. Let us make a fire so big that no politician can ever again ignore it. To those whose beliefs instruct you that only God can decide how a human being should die, I urge you, step aside. May your beliefs sustain you and those you love, but do not impose them on the rest of us. To those doctors for whom doing no harm means that you cannot, in conscience, participate, I urge you too to step aside. Do not stand in the way of other doctors who, in equally good conscience, see leaving a patient to suffer when they are beyond meaningful medical help as doing more harm. Step aside and let no one question your right to do so. The very core of these laws is that they are voluntary for doctors and nurses as much as patients. And to those doctors who are sitting on the fence because you think it's all been taken care of, or because you don't understand how these laws work, educate yourselves. The safeguards written into these laws protect not just your patients, but also you. To the politicians of South Australia, who for the 14th time have a bill before them, and to those of Victoria, Tasmania and New South Wales who can expect new bills within the year, I urge you, do your duty. Debate these laws properly. Understand what they are. Look at the evidence from overseas about how these safeguards work and read this book. Enough copies have been printed for every state and federal politician in Australia. Should you continue to stand in the way of a law for assisted dying, let it be in full knowledge of the suffering taking place in our community because of that refusal. Write this law and right this wrong. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andrew. I think we've scarcely heard a more powerful address at the Press Club on some, some of the most fundamental issues that any of us will ever deal with. We have a number of questions from our assembled media here. I might just start with a sort of a broad, in principle question to you. I wonder to what extent you feel that the resistance to this kind of change is based in our own psychology, a kind of an irrational fear of death. You talked about our natural aversion to being dead, which is a humorous way of putting it, but it's also true, of course. To what extent is it that we just deny the idea of death until such time as we're confronted with it, and therefore we don't want to in a sense, meet this head on?
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, for the record, by the way, I'm fiercely pro-life. I intend to stay alive possibly until the moment I did. But look, I've been amazed to discover, I think this of any issue I've ever looked at, people's emotions govern their logic and their ability to look at this logically, because our most primal fear is that of dying. And the thing that has most surprised me in this is to discover that the group that most strongly reflects this are doctors themselves. They are uncomfortable with this subject. They struggle to talk about it. The surveys which show, they're very disturbing. There was a survey of 1,500 GPs last year which showed that 80% of them had never discussed end-of-life wishes with their patients or treatment. We're all bad at this. And this is part of the reason the organisation I've set up, Go Gentle Australia, is not just about law reform. It's about actually promoting and encouraging a far bigger and more important discussion we need to have, which includes palliative care and advanced care directives. And, we're all in this together, Mark, and I think we can do it much better and in a much kinder way.
Thank you. Question from AAP.
Hi, Mr. Denton. Belinda Merhab from AAP. Thank you for your speech. Malcolm Turnbull has said that legalising euthanasia would be fraught with practical difficulties. He said he doubts any government would ever propose it. Why do you think that successive governments have failed to act in this area, given there is such strong public support, and how confident are you that it can be taken out of the too hard basket?
Well, Malcolm Turnbull would certainly understand the term fraught with difficulties. That's his daily existence at the moment. But look, looking closely, South Australia is a very interesting microcosm of this. As I said, the bill is before them the 14th time. What I've discovered in talking to politicians there and reading back through the history is a couple of things happen. One is that this is confrontational and complex material, and many politicians don't look at it very closely. So they're easily persuaded by vocal groups, and often that's the Christian lobby, Family First, groups like that, the Australian Christian lobby. They're often persuaded by those myths, that sweeping statement of the slippery slope, or that no safeguards can be devised to protect the vulnerable. And because this doesn't get through to a committee stage, it's voted out at the first round, it's never actually looked at in close detail. So this has been a failure of the parliamentary process. And I think the other reason this has happened, which is why I'm here today, is because when I speak to politicians, when I speak to doctors, they say things like, I've hardly ever had a request, or I've never seen this happen. They're not aware of the scale on which this is happening. For instance, in palliative care, Dr. Linda Sheehan did research this year asking palliative care physicians about their attitudes to assisted dying, and 97% of them had admitted that they had received a request from a patient for help to die. But if you're an individual, that may have only happened once in the year, so it's easy to think it's not much of a problem. So I think there's been a lack of awareness with respect to all concerned, doctors, politicians, of the scale of the problem. And I think the Victorian inquiry has done the community a great service by detailing what is happening, and Coroner Ollie in particular, with his undeniable evidence of the suicides that are happening amongst Australia's elderly, evidence, by the way, which was confirmed to me by the South Australian coroner, Mark Johns. I think this now needs to be looked at as hard evidence about what's happening in our community. And I hope, and it's not just me, there's a lot of people who are stepping up on this question now. I hope what's going to change is that politicians no longer feel comfortable to just step away from a solution to this kind of suffering.
Question from the Australian.
Mr. Denton, Joe Kelly with the Australian. In your speech, you identified some people with religious beliefs as a potential obstacle, and you said to those whose beliefs instruct you that only God can decide how a human being should die, I urge you, step aside. Just on that logic, given the law you outlined, do you envisage that would be mandatory in nature for health practitioners and doctors to carry out, or could they object on conscience grounds? Would there be an exemption on religious grounds? And secondly, if I can, I'm just wondering how important enforcement of the requirements of any proposed law would be. One of the issues that continually comes up is that there'll be pressure to further roll back the legislation in this area and relax it. Do you concede that if this happened, that there would still be a campaign to further change the law? And how do you tackle that campaign?
Okay, look, there are two great questions. The first is, no, there is no mandatory requirement on any doctor or nurse or anyone who doesn't believe in this or is comfortable with it or ethically subscribes to it to be involved. In fact, the law mandates that absolutely that is your right to step aside, so let there be no doubt about that. As to the question, people like Father Frank Brennan, a lovely man, I've got to say, if I wanted to have a Jesuit priest at my deathbed, it would be him. But he's put this to me, that what's called the logical slippery slope is that these laws will continue to expand. To which I would say, when you look at the jurisdictions overseas, there's almost no evidence of this. But even if there was an argument for it to expand, that's how democracies worked. We've been debating this for 20 years and not even got to square one where we can help somebody who's dying horribly of cancer to speed up their deaths by 5 minutes. That's what our democratic process has resulted in. Were these laws to be instituted and that there was a strong public argument, for instance? There are 320,000 Australians right now suffering from dementia and Alzheimer's disease. If there was a strong public argument for the laws to be extended to them, then I would expect there to be debate, as there has been, as there is now, and maybe in years to come, future parliaments would legislate for that. That is how it works. But to say that we cannot legislate for this now because of what future generations may want is to deny them even an opportunity to have that conversation.
Canberra IQ.
Simon Groves, Canberra IQ. Just on the theocracy issue, thanks for sharing with us the odd couple of Mr. Burke and Mr. Andrews. That was pretty exotic.
I don't think they've worked together since.
One of the ironies of this debate is that the strongest resistance comes from institutionalised organisations who maintain the notion that there is actually life after death. And not only life after death, but it's pretty good. And it lasts forever, and it's cool. You'd think that as stuff gets pretty shabby on the mortal coil, they might be keen to fast forward. But no. So I'm interested in, you must have looked at this across the religions, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, the lot. Do you see variation in either the institutions and or the believers in their response to the kind of message you're putting?
To be honest, I haven't looked closely at religions like Hinduism or even Islam or Judaism, except to say that according to their scriptures, they are generally not in favour of assisted dying. Although, as the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Lord Carey, said, there is nothing in the Bible that says that this is not allowed or is wrong. And, you know, people's individual faith is absolutely theirs and theirs to enjoy. But, you know, polling done by Essential, by News Poll of our major religions, the Catholic Church and the Anglicans and the Protestants over this last decade, shows very strong support within the laity of these churches for assisted dying laws. And, you know, I think it is one of the issues we're facing here. As I said, the theocracy hidden in our democracy. This is an unrepresentative group. The hierarchy of these organisations are actually derailing the clearly expressed will of the Australian people. And I had one palliative care physician say to me, you know, it really worries me that what this will do to the culture of our country if we have these laws. And I said to her, but don't you see that it's the culture of this country now that people really struggle with? People don't like the thought that those that they love are dying in pain. People don't like the thought that they have no choice about what may happen to them at the end of their lives. It is the culture we have now that is the problem.
ABC Radio.
Philip Clark, ABC Radio. Andrew, this field has been toiled in by others in the past, and I wonder whether the disjunct between, and I'd like your view about this, the disjunct between what seems like an overwhelming public response to it and the professional response to it has been influenced by the activities of those in the past. And I'm particularly looking at figures such as Dr. Philip Nitschke, who some see as a controversial figure, organisations like Exit, for example, which have been working in this field, arguing pretty much the same things that you've been putting to us. How do you assess their contribution, particularly Dr. Nitschke's, and do you think they've helped or hindered the cause that you're advocating today?
That's a great question, and the answer to Philip Nitschke and Exit are both interlocked and different. I think Philip Nitschke has been a hero to many Australians, many older Australians who have desperately been looking for some help, and he's found a way to help them, albeit breaking the law. Having said that, I think Philip Nitschke has also been a huge problem in this debate. I think for many people, he symbolises the debate. And I think there's been a zealousness and sometimes a lack of willingness to listen from him that I think has put people off. However, where Philip Nitschke is at now and where Exit is at now has nothing to do with what this campaign is. Philip Nitschke is about the right to die. He argues that every adult over the age of 50 should have a peaceful pill which they can choose to take or not. I personally don't agree with that, and it's got nothing to do with the law that we're talking about. We're talking about a narrowly written law for desperately ill people who are dying, as I explained earlier. I think also, not just my voice but many others, what is clearly happening, and I think the Australian Nursing Federation are a good example of this, is that far more mainstream voices are stepping forward now and saying, as Australians live longer, as Australians get sicker in ways that are harder to treat, this is a mainstream movement. This is not Philip Nitschke. This is not people who are operating outside the law. This is a mainstream movement of people who are saying to our politicians, we want you to act.
It sounds to me, if I can just jump in there, that what you're saying is that you can be too blunt in this debate, you can be too confronting and, in a sense, create resistance to progress forward, and you think that's what Nitschke and some others have done?
Look, I think Philip is, he is, and he's wanted to be. I've interviewed Philip both for this podcast and previously. He likes to be controversial. He likes a fight. I don't think this is about a fight. There's a beautiful expression Nelson Mandela used to use, which is, let's walk each other home. Dying is not easy. This subject is not easy. I think this is about conversation, compassion, understanding. I've had a lot of conversations with people within the disability community, some of whom are really angry at me for saying the things I've been saying. And as I've listened more to them, I've understood more and more about how deep and genuine their concerns are. This is not about a declaration of this is how it must be. This requires consultation, conversation, understanding and compassion with all those who are involved in this, which, as it turns out, coincidentally, is everyone.
2CC.
Andrew, Tim Shaw from Radio 2CC Canberra. One of our listeners after our chat this morning remarked that as a pregnant woman, she was able to talk with her doctor about the intervention medically for the exact day her child would be born. Mm-hmm. And yet she remarked that as an Australian woman who gave birth to this child on the nominated day with the support of her doctor, that she couldn't end her life on the thesis that you've presented to us today. You and I spoke also about your father and the sadness of his death. Mm-hmm. Do you feel, as part of your proposal, that Australian families should talk about this, the relationship between the doctor and the patient, as you've outlined, but what else should happen? Should those family members be aware of their parents' decision in this regard? And just finally, how do you want to see the Greens bill introduced? Dr. Richard Di Natale's here today, and he announced in June the proposal of the Australian Greens to move forward on this. How do you want to see this handled by those 226 representatives in the lower house and the Senate?
Well, taking the first question first, this is about a bigger conversation about death. As I said before, advanced care directives, about palliative care, about your options at the end of life, even if this law existed and you choose not to take it, such as refusing treatment or withdrawal of medicine that is sustaining your life. You need to understand what your rights are under the law. But it's more than that. You know, I've heard it said that in Victorian times they talked about death all the time and never about sex, and today it's the other way round. you know, it was interesting. I met a doctor called Leah Kaminsky who wrote a book recently called We're All Going to Die, and she was a doctor talking about her own fear of death. And what became clear in reading the book and talking to her, because I thought doctors, you know, this is what they did, but they really, really struggle with it. And, you know, death and tax is the only two certainties in life. We've had a tax summit, for God's sake, but we're not talking about this. We talk about tax endlessly at elections, but we're not talking about this. One of the things that these laws have shown overseas is that they're permissive laws, and what they permit is a conversation between patients and doctors and between patients and the rest of their families. And the stories I got from the families of people that have been legally helped to die overseas were stories of beautiful deaths, of the deaths we would want, of farewells with everything said as people wanted before their disease destroyed them, took them apart bit by bit in front of their families. To your second question about Dr. Di Natale's bill, it only got a small amount of debate in the Senate before the political jamboree was let loose. And I did note that amongst those who spoke were Bob Day and Senator Cory Bernardi. It's probably worth reading their speeches to see textbook examples of fear, uncertainty and doubt being spread. And they were almost fact-free in their commentary. And that is not surprising from people who are coming from a strongly conservative religious point of view. They are willing, as I've discovered, to do just about anything to derail this debate and to distract people with endless, as Nancy Elliott's example showed, endless things which sound scary, and keep people from looking at the actual damage that's been caused by the lack of these laws. That's my job, is to make people look at that and then answer the question, what are we going to do about it?
Question from Tony Melville.
Tony Melville, Director of the National Press Club. I particularly like the bit in your proposed law about your kids not being in the first meeting with the doctor, because I can imagine mine saying, yeah, Dad's ready to go. Let's go. He's out the door. But on the other side of things, you've got laws about organ donations.
Yep.
And what happens repeatedly is that people sign the form, yes, I want to be an organ donor, and then the family steps in and says, no, we don't want it, we don't want to lose, we don't want that to happen. I mean, is there something in this law that can stop that? And also the other, one of the taboos is, big taboos obviously, is suicide. How do you break that idea that it's not suicide, it's something different?
Thank you. The first thing is that these laws are voluntary. The only person that can take that medication in the end is you. So nobody else can force you to take it or force you not to take it. And remember, you have only got to that point because you are in an extreme medical condition. It is true that in some families, and there's one heartbreaking testimony in this book from a doctor, in some families that children will block their parents getting proper medical help because of their beliefs. It is impossible, as we all know, to write a law which legislates every piece of human behaviour for all time. But the way these laws work, where the ultimate decision to end your life is yours, has been shown to work overseas extremely well. The second part of your question was to do with, just remind me again, the suicide. I've been asked this a lot, actually. Why is this not suicide? And it's interesting, when polling is done, if this is referred to as assisted suicide, there's less public support for it than if it's referred to as assisted dying. And opponents of these laws always refer to it as assisted suicide. There is a significant difference, and I'm sure Peter Joseph from the Black Dog Institute would support this. A suicide, which is a tragedy in this country, a suicide is when somebody, for reasons known to them, chooses to take the ultimate dark course of action to end their life because of whatever issues that are in front of them for which they see no solution. They usually take it in isolation, it's often violent, and often, because we're talking about things like depression and things like that, there were solutions. It was possible to find solutions, but they didn't seek them. Assisted dying is, first of all, somebody who is already dying, but secondly, it is a decision taken in full consultation with doctors. It is taken for a very, very pressing reason which can't be solved. It is incurable. It is usually taken in discussion with and in consultation with the family. And as has been shown overseas, when you drink that drink, you do it surrounded by the love and care of those who love and care for you. It is completely different to suicide. And I strongly object, I'm not saying you're doing this, but I strongly object when opponents to this law, as they do, attempt to conflate them both. And the AMA, who to their credit, had a panel discussion about this earlier this year. One of the doctors on that panel very deliberately referred to pressuring 18-year-old men into suiciding. That is a very deliberate misstatement, and that's what I mean when I say it is the duty of our politicians to understand these things, understand what they are, because too many people, your question is a reasonable one, too many people have stopped at that question and gone, oh, well, obviously, this is terrible. This is no different to youth suicide. It's entirely different. And as Peter Joseph from the Black Dog Institute said, assisted dying will help with assisted living. And what he means by that is, and this is an interesting confluence of what assisted dying and palliative care are. Palliative care, which I have incredible admiration for, a lot of what they do is they help people live longer than they might otherwise have lived. Their holistic care gives them greater strength to live longer. Assisted dying does the same because, as Coroner Ollie's evidence showed, elderly Victorians, feeling they have no other option, are killing themselves in violent ways long ahead of when they may have died naturally or when they may have chosen to die if they had control. Does that make sense to you?
We're running very short of time, so we'll just do a couple of quick questions. One from Peter Phillips.
Peter Phillips, Mr. Denton, one of the directors of the National Press Club. Thank you very much for your address. If I can echo Mark's earlier words, one of the most telling and impactful that we've heard at the club for many a day, so thank you again. I take you to your detailed and punctilious research. Could you give us a snapshot of which amongst the 8 jurisdictions at state and territory level in Australia, which is the closest and which is the furthest away from actual passage of even serious engagement of, let alone passage of, assisted dying legislation or regulation?
Look, I think the closest are South Australia and Victoria. South Australia, because this is now the 14th time, and the more it's even brought in front of politicians, the more, whether they want to or not, they become conversant with the issue. But still very difficult. Very difficult, and we've done quite a close analysis of the politicians and seats in South Australia, and even though the Premier has stood up and made an impassioned speech in support, even though the Leader of the Opposition supports a bill, it's a conscience vote and still going to be difficult to get through. Victoria, I think, is different. This committee of inquiry is extensive. It's a significant report, and it's not just about assisted dying. It's across the board about palliative care. It's about advanced care directives. It's about end-of-life care in general. And I think the government has 6 months to respond to it. I think they ignore it at their peril. And, part of my job is to make people aware of what it is. The committee was chaired by Liberal MLC Ed O'Donoghue. It has cross-party support. 6 of the 8 members of the committee supported this law reform. I know that when that committee started, they were split 50-50 as to whether or not there should be a law. They moved in the face of the evidence. So I think what Victorians now know, or are in a position to know about what's happening in their own state, is hugely instructive. So I believe both those states have a real shot. Furthest away, probably because it's never been put before their parliaments, are Western Australia and Queensland.
Final question today from Laurie Wilson.
Laurie Wilson, a freelance journalist and a director of the National Press Club. I want to ask you about illegally assisted dying. In my own mother's case, she was incurable. The situation she was in hospital. You mentioned within the medical system, of course, doctors assisting, but nurses can and do as well, which was the case in this instance. As I was leaving after seeing her for the last time alive, the nurse said to me, "We keep hooking her up and she keeps pulling them out. We think she's trying to tell us a message." I don't think they mentioned the terms that we've talked about today, but it was clear what they meant. And rightly or wrongly, I felt pressured to make a decision, really without discussing it with her in terms of what I thought was her intent. Of course, she did pass away within a week. I'll never know what was involved in that process. So I'm just wondering, do you have a sense of just how widespread that sort of decision-making actually is within our health system?
Look, it's very difficult to know. One of the differences between here and places where these laws exist is that in overseas jurisdictions, they actually have serious research about this. That's part of what these laws were for, a recognition that these things were happening anyway, and they wanted to codify them, and they wanted to be able to research them and answer those very questions. I can tell you, for example, that an academic called Charles Douglas did a survey of Australian surgeons some years ago, which showed that 20% of them had admitted to giving life-ending medication, not always with the patient's consent. Now, that might sound like something dark, but almost certainly it was an act of mercy. But we don't really know. What we do know, and the Victorian inquiry demonstrated this, is that it's not uncommon and across the Australian medical community. We should know. We absolutely should know. And you and your mother and those nurses should never have been left in that position where you couldn't talk about it and where all these years later you don't know what happened.
I think we'll finish on that note. Can I note that we have Anthony Albanese here and Richard Di Natale, two very senior politicians here in Canberra, and clearly they will have absorbed this and understand these issues. There's obviously a massive job of work in convincing our legislators about some of these issues, but as you say, the public support appears to be there, so it will be a very fascinating debate and interesting to watch how your organisation plays a role in that. Can you join me in thanking Andrew Denton today?
Thank you.
Now, you mentioned that you intend to keep on living right up until the time you die.
Yes.
So I'm hoping at some stage you might be able to absorb this book, Stand and Deliver. It's speeches of the National Press Club over its 50 years, a bit more than 50 years now, by one of our directors, Steve Lewis. And here's a membership card so that you're always welcome back at the club. So thank you.
And I'm told this means I can park here. Thank you very much.
It does.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.